Parth Shah is the founder of the Center for Civil Society and the Indian School of Public Policy. His career spans both academia and policy advocacy, including teaching stints at JNU and the University of Michigan. When I was first introduced to Parth, he was contending with the modern unraveling of globalized liberal democracies and felt strongly that one of the reasons for this was how political parties were designed. He felt if political parties are a central lever to democratic life, should they not also be internally democratic? As usual, I try to push back on his intuition, and I hope you enjoy listening.
Hi Parth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Deepak.
For listeners, who is Parth? And broadly, how have you come to this belief about political parties?
Maybe I should say that my first real job was as a professor in the US, and I always remained a professor since then. And so I worked in think tank earlier. Now I'm running an Indian School of Public Policy as a dean. So my engagement has been largely with ideas, and we believe in the power of ideas, basically. And that's really what has been driving me all these years in terms of what I have been doing. And I think part of that was what the recent phenomena of populism around the world, right? On the left and on the right. And I've been hearing various theories around it. Why is it happening? And there are, of course, what the theories are about that. And part of that sort of interrogation that I began to do in the last couple of years led me to this idea that somehow political parties are really at the center of how democracies function.
Yeah.
Right. And in my sort of assessment, there are three different categories of theories for populism's rise. Right. One is the economic theory, which says the globalization and the failure of globalization left many people out, and therefore they are now risen up against the system, and therefore there's a whole anti-globalization trend that you see in large part of the world, right? So the economic explanation for populism. Second is more identity-based, either racial or religious sort of groups which are trying to assert their own majority-minority power, and that has led to this kind of rise in populism. And the third, which largely I subscribe to in a way, is what I call the political theory or explanation for populism. Part of that is obviously the anti-elitism. So most populist groups around the world are very anti-elite, whatever the elites are or whoever they are in any given situation, in any given country. Right? So that explains about the political part of it. Secondly, I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the working of the state. Right? So I see governments are trying to do good. At least they say they are trying to do good. But what I actually observe on a day-to-day basis, right, is exactly the opposite. Right. So my cities get flooded the moment the first rain happens. Right. The air pollution doesn't go away even after 10, 20 years of efforts. Right.
Yeah.
So I see that the state is failing in the basic functions that I expect it to perform. And that, in my view, is also political explanation for populism. That's failure of largely the state to provide basic services. At least in India, and same is true in many other countries. Like US, we talk about the healthcare in the US, how big a disaster that is. Right. And part of that is also, in my view, the electoral system, right? The political system through which we elect our representatives who ultimately sort of govern and make policies, right? And that's how I came, the understanding of the electoral systems. So we have first past the post system, there are primary systems, and there's a Bodo count and rank choice. There are lots of different systems which are being tried. Rank choice has now become a lot more popular in many parts of the world. But you realize that the outcome of an election depends as much on the preferences of the voters as on the type of electoral system that you use, right? And that begins to sort of make you wonder that how much is the current state of democracy is a result of the electoral system that we have chosen, right? And the next step after that was that, because who is competing in the system, right? Political parties. And that's how I came to the political parties as one of the sort of key lever or fulcrum in how democracies function. And I began to think about what do we need to have in a political party for a democracy to function well. That is however broadly we define functioning well, right? And that became sort of my sort of area of focus in the last couple of years to think about understanding populism's rise and focusing on the political sort of part of the dimension, saying that really is the crux of the problem. It's not so much economic, it's not as much as because there is some value in the identity politics that is being played out. In my view, is a more systemic problem. Right? It's not something that happened recently. It's an ongoing problem that has finally surfaced in the way it has surfaced now. Right? And that's my sort of focus on political parties as a key lever of democracies functioning.
Right. And it would help to add some additional context. So when we spoke, you of course mentioned this to me, but also that the possible remedy here is that political parties then have to behave more democratically, right? That is one of the challenges with how political parties are organized today is that they are not internally democratic, despite operating in democracies themselves. So can you give me a little bit of context there? How did one is the identification that the political party as an institution is just a central important figure in the rise of populism, right? Like that's one claim. But then to go from there to say that what we want in an ideal world is for these parties to behave more democratically. How did you make that sort of inference?
So I think one was very simple realization that, if you want to have democracy working well, the people who are going to be running the democracy or democratic system, right, of the government or governance should have some experience of behaving that way, right? And when you see around the world, that's exactly not what's not happening. Right?
Yeah.
So you look at how Trump has come to power or being nominated for the presidential seat, right? And how many of the other leaders have been elected through the system, right? You realize that they have no experience in democracy. Most political parties have become, and even in Western countries to some extent, right, are sort of family enterprises, right? There are fiefdoms run by families, generation after generation in a way. So you realize that the whole structure of my life as a politician, right, from beginning until I get to the seat of power in the government, is really command and control. Yeah. Right? That's what I'm used to. That's what I may have suffered myself as I was rising up in the political party, right? And that's how I govern now that I'm in charge of a political party, right? And so how can you suddenly transform yourself from that experience and that mindset to suddenly become a democratic consultation with the public and larger sort of stakeholder groups and all of that we expect a good policy process to work through, right? It's just not going to be possible. I wouldn't even think about those things. That's not my sort of everyday experience as a politician.
Absolutely. The high modernism that you are subjected to within the party is what you will carry to the democracy when you are in a position of power. And
that's exactly what your followers are expecting. They don't want you to change to something new, right? They have seen you in this way. They command you command their respect because this is how you are, and that is how they want you to be, right? And so you have come through that cycle all through your life, and you are not going to change because otherwise you lose your followers also.
Yeah. And before I go a little bit down this rabbit hole, something you said at the outset was that explanations for populism and its recent rise are things like globalism, anti-elitism, the defense of culture, right? So immigration ruins culture. Yeah. So this is not a project we want to embark on. And the consensus that you bought into was simply poor governance. That when you live in a city where your air is horrible or the streets flood, then as a populist, you're broadly saying that clearly this is not working. This democratic enterprise we have embarked on is not working. And I'm wondering why you are somebody who has, let's say more classic liberal roots, right? Which means that you broadly believe that the state should do less. Is one way of looking at this not just to say that the problem is not the political party or the parties or the electoral system, none of those things. The problem actually lies in how much the state does. That bit of the puzzle is actually fine. The thing to solve for is to reduce the number of things the state does so that capacity increases, so the things that we truly care about that should get done do get done. I'm curious about how you ended up, in some part, assigning blame to this part of the structure, right? The design of the electoral system, the political party, as opposed to, or maybe it may not be opposed, you may say both things are important, but how did blame end up here and not so much on the what the state does side of the puzzle?
Because I think what state does is not even, of course, God-given, right? It's a part of the social, cultural process through which we decide what state is going to do or not do, right? And therefore, to change that is a very different kind of a ball game, right? To change that kind of perception of what states should do or not do. Now, of course, many think tanks, including Center for Civil Society, where I was one part of the project was precisely to educate people about proper role of the state. Right? But my sense is that is an ongoing battle that one were to fight. And that has been there from millennia in a way, right? The role of the state has been debated, right? But that's not really what's causing the challenges now, in a sense. So my sense is that the problem lies on the other side in how we are expecting democracy to work. So we have theory of democracy in one way, the ideal of democracy in our mind, what it should be. And when you see what actually happens under the system is quite the opposite, right? And I think political scientists and others have not reconciled with the fact, right? So the idea of a Plato, for example, democracy of Plato, which is a philosopher king, to the Rousseau's social contract and all of the theories that we talk about, is very, very far removed, right, from what actually the flesh and blood democracy looks like, feels like, delivers for its citizens, right? And that's why I thought, even though we may debate about the role of the state, and of course there's a worthwhile debate to have, it would not even get solved, right, unless we also work simultaneously on through the process through which we are trying to address the debate, right? So one is purely philosophical, intellectual level argument that one can engage in as a think tank, as a professor in a university, right?
Yeah.
Second is, of course, how does that translate into day-to-day working of the state, right? And I think that's where, in a sense, we need both the larger case for proper role of government and at the same time, how would government function, right? And how government functions is largely determined by the elected representatives. That's determined by the electoral system we have, that we have chosen or not chosen, right? And of course, what kind of political parties we have in the country. And that all together decides who is going to run for the office, who is going to get elected to the office, and obviously what are they likely to do once they get into the office. Right?
Yeah.
And unless we focus on that part of it, which is the day-to-day work of government, right, which is done by the bureaucrats and the politicians. And that's really, in my view, is something that needs equal attention. And the reason I'm focusing more on that is because I think the first part is already being addressed. That debate has been old debate and will continue to happen, right? This, I think, is a new, in a sense, is not as much talked about. So when I did some literature review, I didn't find much that focuses on this part of working of political parties. Of course, there's a literature on electoral systems, right? But not really focusing on the way I'm focusing on the value of the electoral system and the choice that we are making and what it implies.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, absolutely. Even when you first brought this to me in the context of this podcast, I didn't find too much of it already written down in serious literature and had to go down a bunch of rabbit holes to really wrap my head around this as an idea. And the first question that presents itself, which I would love your take on, is what the heck is a political party? You know? And I've asked this of other entrepreneurs, where I asked the question, what is a company? And it's a tricky one because everything about the company can change. You could change the board, the employees, the business itself, what you manufacture, right? Just the little name on a piece of paper somewhere persists as a record against some file that the state maintains. And under that sort of profit and loss header sits the company. And it's very hard to define what that company is. It may be harder still to define what a political party is. So do you have some sense of this? Is there like a short way to sort of describe what is a political party? What is that institution?
One way to describe them very similar to how you describe, say, ultimately a company, right? It's a voluntary association of people who believe in particular set of ideas, particular values of governance, right? Who come together to present an alternative to the larger public, right? And that could be a political party in a democracy, it could be a political party even in a non-democratic systems, right? So I think political party generally you can see as a voluntary organization of people, right? Who have certain set of values and ideas about how the larger society or a nation should be governed, right? So what values the nation should have, what are the processes through which we work towards achieving those values, right? Similarly, a company, for example, is a voluntary association of people who have common interest to pursue a particular way of running a business, right, or line of business.
Right.
So I think broadly that would be a definition of political party, right?
Yeah.
It's very conceptual.
No, fair enough. And in the case of a company, as those interests change or those people change, the company morphs. So you can have Volkswagen started as a different business, but today manufactures cars.
Yes.
And similarly, political parties can also morph. The Republican Party of the 1800s is not the Republican Party of 2025, clearly. Or actually, the Republican Party of 2000 is not the Republican Party of 2025, right? Even the last 25 years has seen so much in the US. Okay, that's a fair definition. But, this seems like the intuitive answer. Usually, and in preparing for this, I've been talking to other people also and sort of quizzing them, saying, hey, to you, what is a political party? Like just, layman, common person, what is your intuitive sense of what a political party is? And usually they just say this is an aggregator of preference or an aggregator of ideology, right? So we think that this temple should stand versus they do not think this temple should stand. And this difference in ideology has produced two different political parties. But in practice, just like you were saying that a political democracy in practice does not match the theory. I feel like in practice it does not match the theory. And the example for me, because I live in Bangalore in Karnataka, would be just horse trading in Karnataka elections, right? Like famously anti-incumbent state. And so you have horse trading consistently. And when an MLA jumps Congress to BJP or BJP to Congress, nothing is happening in their brain chemistry. It's not like they're suddenly changing their minds about what they believe in, right? And so the in-practice manifestation of a political party does not seem to be ideology aggregation as much as it seems to be vote maximization or power aggregation. Is it both? Have I missed the mark here?
No, I think it's a great way to describe, both dimensions of it. There's a public choice theory, which is sort of part of economic theory in a sense, which applies economic model to working of political systems, right? Which sort of talks about that ultimately the purpose of political party is to acquire power. If power is not your interest, you shouldn't be in the business of running a political party or being part of it, right? Now, power doesn't mean that something is bad that you're trying to do, right? You need to be in power even if you want to do public good.
Yeah.
Of course, you want to make money for yourself, you still need to be in power, right? So power becomes an instrumental goal for a political party, right? Which is what you are pointing out, that why the horse trading that happens and all of that is basically result of the ultimate goal they have, which is to be in position of power. And if I can be power by joining this party or that party or no party at all, being independent, right? I'm happy to do so as long as my purpose is served. So even though it may sound cynical in some ways, fighting for power, but in my view, that's not really cynical at all. It's just like a company fighting for profit, right? So yes, Narayan Murthy has many other larger goals in his mind when he running Infosys. But one thing is very clear, that to do anything, he has to be profitable first and foremost, right? With whatever ultimate goal that he may be driving himself with, or maybe his motivation is. And therefore, same is true of political parties, right? Ultimately, the goal has to be in power. And therefore, I think it explains a lot of behavior that you see in a day-to-day political sort of systems, right, across the world.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, except for the fact that the rules of the game then have to define how do you then play that game of acquiring power, right? Just like the rules of the game define how a company becomes profitable or remains profitable, right? And I think my sense is that those rules of the game are really the heart of the problem, or is really where the sort of key challenge lies, right? So over the last 150 years, we began to sort of slowly figure out what rules of the game should apply to a company or a corporation, right? Which serves their interest of maximizing profit, right? At the same time, they're also serving a larger public interest, right? So the Adam Smith's invisible hand, right?
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile the self-interest of the board of directors or the CEO of a company or employees of a company, broadly speaking, right? With a larger social interest. And we found the answer in the invisible hand, which says that as long as you have private property rights and an open competition system, right, where there is no monopoly power granted by the state or any outside agency, you would create a system where the pursuit of self-interest would ultimately lead to achievement of public interest, right? And that's the whole idea of invisible hand. So my view is that invisible hand is missing in political system. So we have not yet figured out what system do we need to design, right? Political system do we need to design so that self-interest of the politicians, of the bureaucrats, and of course of the voters, all three are equally important in making democracy work or not work, right? So how do we align the interests of those three main players with the larger social interest of good governance, broadly defined, right? And I think my sense is that what Smith was able to do more than 250 years ago, in a sense, right? To figure out that when you have private property properly defined, enforced, you have open competition, you are creating a system where you cannot achieve your self-interest unless you also fulfill at the same time larger public interest, right? And that invisible hand of politics is still something that we need to figure out.
I understand. As you were speaking, especially in that first half, I was thinking about how frequently you have some stated ideology of a political party, and then to retain power, which is like a very Machiavellian idea, right? That the goal of the state is to first be the state. Under no circumstance can you lose power, rescind power. If that were to happen, then you can no longer execute these ideological questions that you presumably want to bring into action. So you will have a political party who says something like, "We are anti-reservation," or we don't like to use taxpayer capital for public utilities beyond a certain point, right? Strong positions. And then you will see that those positions will be strongly held in, let's say, the Karnataka election, but weakly held in the Bihar election. And clearly these lines are transgressed, forgotten about, brushed under the carpet in the name of holding on to power in that state. And then I'm still wondering, then what is this political party? Because you started with the ideology. You have brought in politicians, voters, broad consensus forming based on this ideological first principle. And then you selectively choose to disbar those principles in those instances where it helps you continue to retain power. So not only is it, I'm going to engage in something like horse trading, where I bring in people who don't ideologically agree, but will vote in my favor as long as, so there's some amount of trading of power that's taking place. But also we're willing to brush some of these principles under the carpet as and when required. So, you may not, I don't think there's a clean answer, but it's a very nebulous thing where as is all politics, you're balancing this odd game of power on one side, ideology on the other. You still have to have a vote bank, so you can't entirely alienate them. But the vote bank is dispersed, right? Like I can think of Trump in especially the 2015-16 years drawing both libertarians and classic conservatives who may disagree on so much, but both decide to vote for Trump, and so he has to appeal to two different vote bases and tread that narrow path. So I don't know if you have any comments on this, but to me this seems like a hard one. Political party is not really a clear answer what it is. That institution feels like one that by and large we keep morphing here and there, some tug of war between ideology and power to broadly be able to continue to enact as a group some policy or the other.
No, I think you're right that it is not that clear cut, right? And maybe when you think about political parties' primary purpose being in power, right? Then some of this other things will make sense. Ideology is simply an instrument that I'm using to get to power, right? A vote bank is an instrument for me to get into power, right? So I think once you see that primary purpose is to be in power, right? Without being even cynical, is a factual statement anyway, right? Then I think many of the other things possibly would make sense. That I'm not ideological in his own right, irrespective of what's going on around the world or what would bring me to power, right? My ideology actually is there to serve the purpose, which is to be in power. My vote bank is to serve that purpose. My policy positions are for that purpose, right? Which is why you can explain why people flip-flop from time to time, right?
Yes, to stay in power.
Yeah, to stay in power. So I think one way which is what I think public choice does very clearly and without any, they say, politics without romance, right? That ultimately the purpose of politics is to be in power, right? So as you say, Machiavellian way of thinking, which is actually a descriptive, accurate way of positing it, right?
Yeah.
Now, as I said, it doesn't mean that you are going to do evil things. You could also do good things by being in power, right? Same thing we say about bureaucrats. What is their self-interest? We say their interest is to have a larger budget and larger turf to control, the territory or the domain to control, right? Now, it may sound cynical at one level, but of course it's also factually descriptive statement about what is it that serves their purpose. The purpose may be to do public good, right? Or to acquire power or to collect, make more money for themselves. But any of those purposes that you may have, one thing you do need is a large agency that you control, right? In terms of budget as well as in terms of turf. And if you control that, you can do more public good. Say I was in charge of Delhi Jal Board. Of course, the more money I have, hopefully more people I can serve and provide them 24/7 water, right? But no, so it can work either way. But in a sense, the instrumental goal remains a larger budget and a larger domain to control. Similarly, for politicians to be in power, right, to get elected or re-elected is the primary sort of goal.
Yeah.
And I think once you see it from that way, just like the way we describe consumers and businesses, right? We say consumers are trying to maximize their utility, right? However they define that. And businesses are trying to maximize their profits, right? So often that's seen as a negative connotation, but it's not really, doesn't have to be that way, right? It's a factual thing that no matter what you want to do, what ultimate motivation you may have, you have to be at the minimum profitable.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree.
Yeah.
Do you think that, so you landed on the conclusion that we want political parties to be more democratic as one of the ways to solve for this? Why not land on the conclusion that we want to eliminate political parties? Is there a practical democracy that can be built that does not have this institution at all? Voters vote individuals into power. And ideally this is happening at fairly localized levels. And those individuals then as representatives go into parliament and then hopefully enact the will of the people. And here I want to tug at the strings of your liberal heart, right? And say that our group identities rarely define us well. So you and I may agree on foreign policy, but may disagree on farm laws. And in a world sans political parties, we have to form unions basis the subject, the idea in question, as opposed to having a whip and this being broad consensus building. So there is a utopia there where you can have a non-political party-based democracy and have better results than one with political parties or democratic political parties.
I think I don't really have an answer to that question, which is direct in that sense. But I think the point that you are raising is a very important point, that almost at the founding of every democratic system in the world, right, from Athenian democracy to Greek democracy or to the American one, right, almost at all of these points in time, the founders who were there, right, have always asked this question: can we have a democratic system or governance system broadly defined, which does not require having political parties? Because most of them are quite skeptical, right, of what the political parties would do, right, what kind of intermediary they would become, right, between the people and the government or the governance system, right? So the large number of Federalist papers in the US, actually there's a whole discussion around, can you design a system where you can function without a political party, right? So I think that's really is true. I don't think we have yet figured that out in terms of how that can be done. But that brings us to, I think, other point which has been sort of playing in my mind since I started this sort of inquiry myself. And one motivation for that also was the 75th anniversary of India's constitution. I was just sort of going through the history of it, like many of us were at the point in time. And I came across by accident this website, which had kept the documents of the other constitution that were offered by different groups of people in India, right? There's a one which was offered by the Communist Party of India, right? They had their own vision, in a sense, of what the free India should look like, right? Similarly, there's a one offered by the followers of Ram Manohar Lohia, right? Very different way of thinking about the governance of free India, right? And of course, along with all of them, there's a one offered by the followers of Gandhi, right? So Sriman Narayan, one of the Gandhian economists, puts together a document. Gandhi actually has a preface to the document saying that this idea has been discussed with me. I am broadly in agreement with them, though of course I cannot endorse everything which is in the document, right? So you can call it a Gandhian sort of constitution in that sense. And there are two things that sort of struck me the most and related to what we are discussing. So one was, they also talked about politics without political parties. As you know, Gandhi was quite vehement and vocal about disbanding the Congress, right? Once we got the independence,
right? Because
Gandhi thought that couldn't be a political party. It was a party to fight for freedom. And therefore, once that goal was achieved, that should not continue as a political party. And one reason for that, one motivation for that also was, he wanted to have more fragmentation, right? As opposed to having this monolithic party, which is All India Party to begin with, right? And therefore, he thought that by banning Congress, you will create that possibility of local parties sort of coming up, or maybe no parties at all, right? That's really, so his idea of Gram Swaraj also sort of fits into that if you were to govern only small localities, then maybe you don't really need political parties. There's nothing much to be done with a political party that cannot do individually in that system, right? So that was one part of it they also discussed. The second one, which also relates to this one, which was in the Gandhian constitution, was that do elections only at the one level of governance, right? At the lowest level of governance, most local level. And so, for example, you run the election for Gram Panchayat or City Council, whichever the local level is, right? People who get elected at that level, some of whom get elected from that body to represent at the district level. From district, some of those who are at the district level can get elected from that group of people to represent the state level. And those who are at the state level, some of whom get elected or selected for the national level, right? So the member of parliament in that structure is actually not representing a large parliamentary constituency as it does today, right? He's representing very small constituency locally. Could be a small ward in a city or even a small Gram Panchayat, part of Gram Panchayat that he or she represents, right? So two things happen, maybe three things. One, there's a direct connection to the local citizens. I live in the same neighborhood even as an MP as I would have lived as a Gram Panchayat member, right? So you are not coming from two different constituencies in that sense. You're all coming from the same constituency, right? So that builds huge connect with the grassroots in a sense. And of course, that has a lot of advantages, as we know, not just accountability, but also getting to know what people really want, right? That has really become difficult in the current system that we have. So that was one big benefit of having that one single level of election, and people are getting elected from that level onwards. Secondly, and I think much more importantly for our discussion about political parties and role parties play, see, one of the important role for parties is to money. It takes huge sums of money, as we know, to run for an office of any significance, right? It's very difficult for people to individually have that kind of money, right? And therefore, parties becomes the vehicle through which you would collect the funds, right, in one way or the other, which allows the parties then to fund the candidates that they want to run for the offices. Of course, candidates also put in their own money in the process. But that's really one reason why you need a political party organization to collect this money year after year after year, right? But if you have only local election, in the Gram Panchayat or ward level, you really don't need that much money, right? Demand for money just goes down so significantly, right? And therefore, one less reason to have political party as an intermediary in the process, right? And the third, which I think is probably in my view, they didn't talk about at the time, but now I think when you look at the skills, the aptitude, right? The persona that you need to get elected in a democracy today is quite different than the skills, persona, and aptitude and knowledge that you need to provide good governance, right? So you can see that Nehru can get elected and be a good governor, right, of the system. But today, it's very difficult to find that combination, right? You see divergence between the two because the skills required to get elected in today's system are so very different. And Trump is a classic example of that, right? Then the skills required to be a good administrator, right? A good sort of manager of a governance system, right? And those skills are getting more and more divergent. And one of the sort of benefits of having local elections is that you have people like Nehru and middle-class citizens be able to compete in the political system, right? So those two things, I think, are very important to think about, right? Third thing that comes up, and which is something they mentioned briefly in the Gandhian constitution, and which I was very sort of surprised to see that there, because I did not know until that point in time how important that point was. And that's what they talk about, random selection. So interestingly, even in India, during Chola Empire, right, we know this because there are inscriptions on the temple walls in southern India, Tamil Nadu particularly. You find the system they had for selecting, say, Gram Pradhan. They also had somebody in charge of water bodies of the village, right? So they used to have these various positions in the village. And the way they chose people to fill those roles and responsibilities was not by campaigning, right, for that position. They would say there are minimum requirements that you must meet to qualify yourselves to be considered for that position, whatever that may be, right? Gram Pradhan or person in charge of the water bodies of the village, right? And as you fulfill those positions, you basically put your name in a matka, in a pot, right? And somebody will just draw a name name randomly from that matka,
Yeah.
and the name that comes out becomes the Gram Pradhan or the person in charge of the water bodies of the village, right? Again, turns out that this is not just idea practiced in Indian history. It was how actually many of the senators in the Roman Empire got selected, right? So there's a whole machine that was created at the time, and you have now pictures of that available also on the website.
Amazing.
Something called Claroteron or something along those lines, where you can put a sort of coin with a name on it through one of the holes on the top. It just goes through randomly various zigzagging, and if it comes out on the right hand side, then you get elected. You're selected for the role. It comes out on the other side, then you are denied. Right? Completely random selection about who is going to become the senator. Right? And when you begin to think about this, there's just so many advantages of this idea of random selection. Right? And turns out there's a lot of now, as I dig deeper into it, a lot of literature also on that. There's a very popular TED talk given by some guy in Europe talking about random selection. The technical term is sortition. And it's a very powerful idea. Right? It turns out that what I find interesting in all of this discussion that we have about political parties and no political parties, right? Power of money, random selection, is that most of these ideas have been talked about at the birth of every democracy.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's very interesting that people who were thinking about democratic governance realize that these are all the various tools and methods and techniques that we should be thinking of, right? And with some combination of that is a better way of governing ourselves than one single method as a universal method of governing or choosing people who govern us.
As you were telling me that story, I was thinking about, I'll try and find the book because it's not coming to mind. I'll try and link in the show notes and I'll share it with you as well. So it's just exploring. So the premise is that we have not explored democracies enough, right? Like by and large, where we are in this democratic enterprise, especially liberal democracies, very early days, just a couple 100 years. And one proposition is that not everybody should be allowed to vote, right? And of course, this is automatically going to enlist meaningful outrage because the whole point of the democratic enterprise is this universal franchise. And the way out of this, he proposes, it's like a little bit of a thought experiment, is every election cycle, you pick, let's say, 100 people at random from across the country, right? These are entirely random people that are simply picked and brought into a hotel room. And those 100 people are allowed a few days in the room, entirely blocked off from the rest of the world, like a jury in the US, to come up with a meaningful test, right? This is the test that the voter has to pass to be able to vote in that election cycle. The test can comprise of anything you want. You can say, what is the price of milk? You can ask, how many articles are there in the Constitution? Whatever this group of 100 people feel is a reasonable grounds for a test that allows you as a citizen to vote is what. So now it's still democratic because ultimately the test that you have received is what everybody has received and is set by your peer. It is not set by the state or by some political enterprise, which means we distill the total elector base from, let's say in India, 1.6 billion people to maybe 100 million people who are able to meaningfully pass the test. And they then go ahead, follow our existing democratic process and elect representatives. And the premise is that perhaps this leads to better results because this group of more enlightened citizens, enlightened by the definition of that test, which was set by their own peer group. So there's no universal test for this enlightenment. It changes every cycle. Should do a better job at picking better representatives. And the base of the theory was something like, we may not be good at at knowing the answer to a problem. So what should we do with farm laws? You and I may not know the answer because we may just not have enough context about that problem. But we are very good at identifying competence. That by and large, we can point at somebody and say, this person is competent to resolve this problem. So if we're able to use that and just identify indicators of competence and then have competent people make electoral decisions, we're better off. So yeah, I agree with you. I feel like this design problem is really interesting. And there are so many unique solutions. This is a terrible one, just given how much work and effort it will take to execute. But as a thought experiment is still, I thought, like an interesting premise. On your point regarding money, that was something that I'd written down as definitely should be discussed as part of this podcast, because we spoke about preference aggregation, we spoke about power aggregation, but capital seems to be one of the driving motivators behind the existence of political parties, right? And here I have two questions. The first is, if you think about this this gram level method of having super localized representatives, right? The hypothesis is that then you will not need too much capital because it's just a small space. It's not money on campaigning, etc. But you could also conclude that the richest person then wins. That is, the most wealthy person in that little ward is the one who's most likely to win because they have the highest amount of money to be able to execute a campaign. That won't cost them too much, but they'll retain power. Retaining power in that local ward means that is their whole universe, right? That little place is where they live, their family lives, their extended family, their business. And so it makes sense for them to hold political power as well. And will be willing to spend quite a bit of money to hold political power there. And in that case, doesn't it not make sense for, let's say you are in the adjacent ward and both of us broadly agree on something. And we say, look, let's go to person C who's willing to finance us because they agree with what we believe in. And let's set up an interim entity where we put this money and you get half and I get half, or we spend it, at actuals based on what we have to print and paste and campaign. And then inevitably you end up in this world of so in that way, like a political party as an aggregation tool for capital seems inevitable. If I want to embark in political enterprise and want to be successful, then I need to have as much money as the player who is the biggest player in my space. Inevitably, then I'm going to fundraise. Inevitably, then I'm going to have a political party. So that's point one. But I'll let you respond. Like, does this feel like an outcome that's obvious?
It's possible, right? So I think what you're describing is logically a possibility. My sense is that if you really follow what the Gandhian Constitution sort of talks about, right, as a very local level election, then you don't really need that much money to begin with, right? Of course, if you had more money, you can do more with it, right? I think more importantly, once you see that kind of structure of governance, right, also it becomes clear that there is not that much money to be made by being in position of power, right? So one reason why I think the demand for money keeps increasing every cycle after cycle, there's more and more money to be made, right? By being in that position of power, right? And therefore, there's also an implicit auctioning going on, right? So who is going to get a chance to make that money, right? So we are all bidding for it by the amount of money we are spending, each one individually, to contest in the election, right? So it is, in a sense, basically a rent-seeking enterprise as public choice defines it, right? And therefore, I think there's a lot more pressure in raising money and fighting those elections. If you think from this point of view, that if much of the work, 80% of the work and 90% of the work was done by your Gram Panchayat, right, and your city council, there's very little done by the state or by the national parliament, right, then even the possibility of making large sums of money itself reduces because your control is over the Gram Panchayat, right? Even if you take everybody's money, how much money can you possibly make, right? So I think the stakes become so low, right, which is why the argument that ordinary people will be able to compete in this kind of system. You don't need that kind of resources, right? If you're a good person, have good reputation in the neighborhood, helping out people and all of that, you can rely on that kind of long-term good that you have done to run for the office and be elected, right? Which is impossible today even to think about, right? One of the challenges most of the sort of social activists face, that people are willing to die for them as an activist. When they're activists, like Narmada Bachao Andolan, Medha Patkar, right? People who stand in the water, even water goes above their head, right? They're willing to die for it. But they would not vote for her. So when she ran for the office, she got barely that many votes, right? So I think that link between good citizen, a public servant in a sense, genuine way on your own right, and being able to become public representative, the link becomes a little tighter. Or I guess the possibility becomes a little tighter in such a system, right? I think therefore the stakes are so low that you wouldn't need to make this kind of deals with the rich person to fund you so that you can run for the office. And obviously rich person would demand his own payout at the end when you win the election, right? So all of that in a sense becomes so much smaller. And also coming to our initial discussion about role of the state, right? So Gandhi obviously, as you know, was an anarchist by heart. Right? I mean, there are quotations after quotations in Gandhi's writings, which define states as the ultimate source of violence in society. So if you want to be non-violent society, the first thing you have to do, according to him,
eradicate the state.
Is control or eradicate the state, right? Because there's an organized form of violence, right? And therefore, he was always very mindful of the fact that how can we reduce that power of the state? and which is why the idea of Gram Swaraj, right? So people saw it as more of a social sort of enterprise. I think it was equally in a political enterprise in Gandhi's mind, right? And from now, when you look back, that seems much more valuable as a political enterprise, right? If we had thought about those ideas at that point when these ideas were presented. As you know, Gandhi obviously had a huge respect, right? We respected him in the Constituent Assembly. But turns out that, none of these ideas were taken seriously in the Assembly. I think there was some debate, when I go through the Assembly debates, some debate about it. There are a few people who kept talking about Gram Swaraj and all of that. And few of those things got into our directive principles of state policy, part of the Constitution, but not really the main structure or design, right? And Sriman Narayan talks about in the Gandhian Constitution that can we think of something which is completely new or different from the Western model, right? So maybe motivation was being anti-West in that sense. But I think it was a great way to think about our own history, right? And the history of other democracies. Like in the Chola Empire and all of that, we know a little bit about now. Unfortunately, we don't know as much details of how those things worked. But it would have been so useful and important to debate those ideas out in the assembly at the time than simply borrowing from 5, 10, 15 different constitutions and putting them together.
As you were talking, I just remembered a dear, like somebody I know very closely, recently tried to get a driver's license and had to pay the bribes that are expected of an Indian citizen to get a driver's license. And when he was talking to the peon, he said, what's happening here? Like, why are we paying bribes to be able to get a license? And the peon said, sir, it goes to the top, right? Like the guy right on top. And it's an ROI question. So the chief minister and their team have spent so much money getting him elected that now we have to make a return on that investment, which means from the person who gets appointed to the RTO to every meaningful position of power that bureaucrats hold, they pay, inward, and then we collect from the citizens. So the whole thing is just money, right? Like we want to get an ROI on the investment to get into power. So on that money bit, unfortunately, it seems like completely true. The second point I had at the time on the money question was the use of public funds. So countries like Germany don't allow you to raise money for a political party. So you can't go to another private person and borrow or take money from them. Instead, it is only public capital. So you'll enlist as a political party. And I'm assuming there are some checks after which you get on the roll. But once you do, then you are just given the same amount of capital. And this is from public funds. And it's treated like a public utility, right? The idea is that a political party is a public utility. And so it makes sense to use taxpayer capital to finance these parties. There is a common sense premise that by and large, they need some amount of money to spend to campaign, to get the message out. So you cannot operate on zero funds. But also we don't want to skew the playing field by some folks having significantly more capital than the other. Ideally, on the same amount of money, you should be able to have the same amount of reach. And so the best idea wins. So the best politician wins as opposed to the richest politician or the ones with the most money. How do you feel about this as an idea?
No, I think that's a very interesting argument. I have not really gone too much in depth in assessing it, though I know generally the liberals have been quite not so in favor of public funding of political campaigns or elections, right? So there is a apprehension around that. But I think given that apprehension that most liberals have, I think it's worthwhile thinking through it. Because I think what technologies we had available in 1930s, 40s, 50s or 60s, right, are very different than what we have today, right? And therefore, in my view, some of these ideas have to be reassessed as sort of technology changes, as the social structures are changing, right? As the awareness generally in the society is different than what it was 50, 60 years ago. So I do agree that it's an important thing to think about, right? So if you are not able to reduce the constituency size and go really local and thereby reduce the power of money in that way, right? You need some money. In that case, then you think about, okay, how much of that should come from private sources and how much of that should come from public sources, right? And that's, I think, a lot of countries have tried this. Germany, obviously, a classic example of that. Though I might suspect that, one big hurdle in implementing that idea of public funding could be just state capacity to monitor and enforce that, right? So you can easily imagine in today's India and most of the countries in our part of the world, it will be very difficult for any government to be able to enforce that you only take public money and no private money will be utilized in running a campaign, right? And therefore I see there's a challenge of state capacity there, even if the idea is generally acceptable. of implementing the idea, right? And therefore, I think for a foreseeable future, we are dependent on private funding, right? And in my view, if you sort of follow the argument of the Gandhian constitution, turns out that there are other solutions to the problem, which are even far more systemic and fundamental, right? Than just trying to figure out who funds the election cost.
Yeah. Yes. I don't know. This whole rabbit hole is very interesting to me. I never thought about it, and then when I went down, I'm realizing how many of my priors I have not questioned. On the question of funding, just as like an additional add-on, how do you feel about enforcing making funding public? That is, if you as a political party have raised money, you should be forced to disclose to the public who and how much you've raised, who from and how much you've raised. Do you think that's reasonable? And to push back, like if you do think that's reasonable, on the other side would simply be the liberal premise, right? I own my body, I own my private property. The wealth I have accumulated is a factor of my labor or inheritance, and hence my private property. This concept of privacy applies to it, which means you are a private citizen, me a private citizen. Our transaction is not privy to the state. Now, if some of those funds were to be used for political purposes, that may so well be your prerogative and or mine, none of the business of the state or the people. So that's the more libertarian, liberal way to push back and say, no, we shouldn't actually enforce making any of this public, how much money and who you've raised money from.
But we do all the time. If you look at any public corporation,
yeah,
right? All the source of revenue and of course expenditures are all in public domain, right? So I don't think it's really issue of libertarian rights to private property and privacy in that sense, because where it should apply very directly is in the business world, right? And there, if you are a limited company or a public listed company, so many disclosures you are required to make, right? And the people who own shares in the public, it's also known what percent of shares, who owns that, right? So there's a lot of, and that is how we actually do our annual general meetings where the votes are cast on pretty specific resolutions, right? All of that. So go through that working of a private corporation, right? You see that is all about private money being transacted by private individuals, but most of the processes and outcomes are in public domain.
Right?
Right?
I would think that, so for publicly listed companies, they've made this additional step. So you start off as a private listed company, and then you say, I am looking to raise money on a stock market. And a term and condition of listing is that I will make public my revenue, expenses, P&L, all of those statements. So there's still the element of consent that if you want to go public, these are terms and conditions, else don't go public. However, if I'm a fully privately held company, then I should be allowed to transact in the privacy. Nobody has any business knowing my business. Now, the exception case here may simply be filings, because if you say that the state has to operate with taxes, and the taxes are a result of income, which now then should become a question, should it be a percentage of income? But let's say it is as it is today. Then you have to compulsorily file. But there is no such equivalent on the political party side, right? I can't make a meaningful argument for why the political party must be forced to make this public, because there is no market. That additional, here the terms and conditions are, if you want to sell to the public and they want a bird's eye view before they make meaningful transactions, then we need you to otherwise if you're a private company, it's perfectly fine. How can I be a private political party?
You can be, but you won't be a political party in that sense, right?
Yeah. It doesn't meet the definition.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think you can say, is a political party similar to a private private company?
Or a public company?
Or is a public listed company, right? So, and argument would be that it is more similar to, in a way, or adjacent to the publicly listed corporation than a privately held company, right? And therefore, similar rules would apply, right? Actually, I've been doing that exercise myself. So, looking at how we regulate companies, particularly publicly listed companies, because I'm using that as a sort of parallel, right? And see Companies Act.
It's
right?
like a it's a Bible.
It's a tome, right? There's so many rules and regulations, and obviously court judgments on the top of that. And if you add them up, which is why, of course, all these lawyers and accountants make a living out of it, right? And so I think compared to that, we are nothing for political parties, right? So the Representatives of People's Act, which is the only part which sort of, in a sense, regulates some part of the working of political parties, right? So as you pointed out, they are required to file their audited accounts every year to the Election Commission. Though nothing happens if you don't, They just get a reminder from the election commission that आपका account अभी आया नहीं है, right? Beyond that, nothing really is a penalty that election commission is supposed to impose, right? But imagine what would happen to a corporation if they did not submit their audited accounts, right? We now also hold the auditors accountable for the audit they do, right?
Yeah.
So, because there are so many cases of that.
Yeah.
So I think if you look at the way we have, in a sense, one way to think about this, regulation is also a means of aligning self-interest with public interest. Now, of course, you can overdo regulation, and in many cases we do, right?
Yeah.
But some parts of that I think, is part of well-functioning market economy, right? And of course, if you go back in the history, many libertarians and free market economists point out that many of the rules that we currently have on the books are simply adopted after the fact by the government. So these are the rules that evolve, in a sense, spontaneously within the process of discovery and competition, right? So I want to compete with you as a corporation, then what can I offer to my investors that you are not offering? And slowly some of these things that we currently do came about automatically, right? As a way of the competing between the companies. And therefore, what happened at the end was simply codification of that, which was already a market process in operation. One can argue that obviously by codifying, we sort of stop the process from evolving further, possibly. So that's a downside of it. But in one way, this is what emerged, right? It's not that somehow the very wise people of the government thought about all of these rules and regulations themselves.
At the outset.
At the outset, and put them up in the books, right? It always has come about from the people and the market process itself, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And same is true for the pharma industry, for example. All the pharmacopoeia of the world are what the companies were doing on their own, and that got codified as a pharmacopoeia, and the purity of drugs and all of that sort of follows through it, right? So much of that is, of course, what we, in our own voluntary interactions and part of the process of discovery and competition, that we figured government took that result of the process and say, okay, now we require everybody must follow this, right? And so in some ways, it's not so much anti-market in many cases. Of course, as I said, you have to judge the regulation in terms of the history as well as its impact.
Yeah. I think broadly this is how common law, so you have norms, and the norms lead to some sort of common law outcomes. I hear the argument. And I mean, broadly what you're trying to say, to steelman your position, is that the regulatory maturity that we have seen on the company side, the company being an institution that is, intersubjectively true, we've concocted as a way to transact, does not seem to replicate on the political party side. Like that sort of regulatory maturity has still not been arrived at, let's say.
I admit that I don't really know what it even means to say that a political party should be democratically governed. So I'm not very clear, right? What does it actually mean? Right? Yeah. So I think that itself is an interesting question, and there is not really much written on that. The people may have talked about democratic governance of political parties, but in details, what does it mean?
Yeah.
So would we have the party members as like a shareholders, in a sense, similar to that, and have the rights and responsibilities of the party members, and who would then, in a sense, decide what the party does, right? So what's the role of party members then, and who becomes party member and how and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, Karyakartas are they party members?
Yeah.
Are folks who hold office party members? In fact, there's exactly, I have actually one final question I want to ask, and then this that you've asked me is basically what I want to quiz you about. And if you don't have clear answers, then we can go back and forth a little bit, because I'm very curious about to think about this, and I think this is the second half of the podcast for sure. Because in that problem statement, political parties must be internally democratic. We've spent some time on the political parties bit, but the internally democratic bit is the one that we are yet to explore. But I'm just as curious. Maybe a final question before we head off into a short break, right? In your thinking around how the Gandhian constitution or similar ideas advocate for hyper-local governance, and then that working its way up, right? So it's bottom up by design. One potential pitfall may simply be that it doesn't attract incredible talent. And to steelman the argument for this, what I would say is something like, let's say you were to believe that a Donald Trump was a fantastic politician, right? You were the sort of conservative or Republican in the US today who would vote for Trump no matter what, and you think is a phenomenal outcome in that political environment. Donald Trump would never stand for election if all it meant was power in his local ward, right? And I suspect many politicians today, who you and I may respect, maybe phenomenal politicians, would not even choose politics as a career, potentially, if what it meant is that the epitome of power for me is my local ward, and then it's not even a game of popularity. It's not like I can go around evangelizing my points of view and then be able to make prime minister or president or get a portfolio in a ministry. At best I can get, Do you feel like this is a flaw in the design where then we just weed out great candidates potentially and what we're left is fairly mediocre candidates because that degree of power is what suffices for them?
It's an interesting question. I was just thinking, how has that been discussed and debated in the past, right? So one part of the argument that was made in the past was, and what we discussed earlier about political parties, right? The whole discussion around democracy without political parties. One reason for not having political parties was precisely this, that you will create career politicians, people whose whole life would be in politics. They would have done nothing else in their whole life, right? And people thought that was a bad thing. Because somebody just doing politics is not a good idea. Right? And therefore, the kind of money the political parties would generate and they're unable this kind of lifelong sort of politicking, right, is not a good thing. And that was one argument against political parties. That will sort of reduce more people becoming lifelong politicians, right? And there's a whole literature, again, in the Federalist Papers about career politicians versus citizen politicians. So there's a very interesting contrast being drawn in the literature about people who serve in public life for some period of time, but they have larger life outside that system, right? So either you're a business person, maybe whatever else you are doing in your economic life, and you choose at some point in time that, okay, I want to serve as a Gram Pradhan or a guy in charge of water bodies of my town, right? Whatever that may be. And I think that's so people thought that was the ideal politician for the community. The person who takes time off from his regular life to devote some time to the public service, right? And therefore, there's such a great deal about public service, right? It's seen as such a great moral thing to do, right? And it's true across societies, not just in Western societies, right? And one reason for that is also that you are not career public servant in that sense, right?
Right.
You are choosing to do this as part of your life among many things that you are doing. And of course, once you think along those lines, you realize the advantages of citizen politician, right? Because you have done other things. Just like what we say about bureaucrats today, right? They have spent whole of their life, adult life, right? In a very different situation where they never had to stand in a line to do anything, right? Everything was done for them, given the position they occupy. The moment they retire, they're completely lost because now everything requires they do it themselves. Right? And therefore, I think career politicians are in the same situation because when they get into power, only thing they have done is politics. Right? They have no idea of what it takes to run a business. They have no idea what it even takes to run a non-profit, right? Not even a profit corporation or any organization of value in that society other than political party.
I have two things to push back on here. First, it seems like the latest wave of populism does favor the citizen politician. Argentina, Canada, the US, these seem to be the citizen politician and not the career politician who's come to the fore. So perhaps my original question stands that even for the citizen politician to shift track to politics, if it means that my highest degree of power is going to be at the local level, is simply not enticing enough. So great citizens will never come into the fore, probably. And then second is one of the meaningful criticisms that citizen politicians get is that they don't get politics. Because when Trump walks into the Oval Office, everything is going to likely be set on fire and break, because this institutional knowledge of how this large governance structure works, even if what you intend to do is upend it, you must have a meaningful understanding of why the fence is there before you pull it down. And that is entirely absent. So, do we truly want to favor more citizen politicians? Perhaps at the ward level, because there's not much to break. And but at the larger the number of things that you can potentially control, the more likely it is that we want somebody who is a career politician. And then second, if all the power I can get is, at a ward level, then why would great citizen politicians come into the fore? Am I making sense? Like this seems incongruent.
My sense is, I think we are also assuming that the power, right, would remain in the same structure or same hierarchy as we see today. So if you are going to be ward-centric or Gram Panchayat-centric governance system, right, then much of the power would be at the ward level, right? So 80% of work is getting done at the ward level, the Gram Panchayat level, right? There is very little that is getting done at the parliamentary level, at the national level, right? And therefore, even though it may seem like a bigger title, you're sitting in the national capital as opposed to your village capital, right? Or district capital. So it may look like a bigger thing, but in terms of power, you maybe have only two functions to perform. Maybe run a defense for the country, right? And foreign policy.
Right.
The rest all is done by the state or the local governments, right? So power really is, in a meaningful sense of the word, right, at the local level. That's really how you structured the whole system, right? And therefore, the guy who becomes the councillor at the ward or a Gram Panchayat Pradhan is probably similar to the Prime Minister of India today in the current structure of hierarchy and power distribution, right?
Super interesting. Okay, as we wrap our brains around that, we'll get into a quick break. When we come back, hopefully we talk about what it means for something to be democratic. Hi Parth, welcome back. You believe in free markets. And the question I have is why that does not apply to political parties. So the way to phrase this is, if I want to buy a certain type of good or service, by and large the free market delivers, right? It will identify that there is a need, that I'm potentially a buyer, and a seller will emerge who will meet that need. And if it doesn't exist yet, then there is space for an entrepreneur to go and build for that need, because clearly it's a market, an unmet need. And so the thing that they seek, which is profit, in this case a bottom line, can be easily yielded by solving that need for that buyer. If we were to just translate this to the political side, if a need existed for a truly democratic political party, and we can spend some time after this, of course, asking what does the word truly democratic mean. But we also agree that by and large political parties today are not democratic. They're all central command, top-down control. If that need existed, then it would have emerged. That is, if as a populace we wanted or respected or cared about this sort of political parties being democratic, that would have happened. And I feel like we do have a broadly free market for political parties. Right? It's not hard for you or me to start a political party today. So what's the gap here? Why do we not have democratic political parties in a potentially, presumably, free market for political parties?
Well, you stumped me. It's a very good question to think about, actually. That, if you generally have a free entry and exit, which is what we do have in the political space. I'm just trying to think about how we think about the market, right? The comparison that you are making. So market for goods and services on one hand, and the market for, power. Maybe we want to think about that, what political parties are for, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was your original definition, right? That's Machiavellian, let's hold on to power mindset. Yeah.
Right. So how are those two markets different, right? In terms of what the ultimate goals are. And of course, that defines what the processes are going to be. Right? The process, by that we mean the degree kind of competition that would happen and what are you competing on, right? So I'm going to think through a little bit of that what's the difference between what a traditional market firm does and compared to that, what a traditional political party does.
Can I offer a possible explanation? Yeah. I think that democratic political parties are worse at meeting this end, the end being the acquisition of power. There are two potential reasons for this, in my mind. One, that democracy means debate, and that means a non-unified front. So a democratic political party will seem to the public as a non-unified front because internally there is debate on what they ought to do, who they ought to elect, who the face should be, what the position should be. Even within a position, there are shades of grey, right? Versus a political party who's presenting a single unified front. This is our position and we all agree. This is not even a matter of debate or discussion. So that may be why they are unable to coalesce a vote base as well as a non-democratic party. And then second, maybe democratic political parties bring to the front more radical members because to be able to win a democratic election, even internally, versus to be able to win a democratic election externally may not be the same set of criteria. So for this, I'm going to read from an article that I'd read speaking about explicitly this, right? And it's a quote. So I'm quoting and I'll link it in the show notes as well. It says, non-democratic political parties may be better for democracy. And the quote is, a political party may be internally democratic or electorally successful, but not both at the same time. This is because active party members tend to be more radical than average voters. Empowering the rank and file can shift a party's ideology to an extreme that alienates middle-of-the-road voters, undermining the party's core function of winning elections to implement policy. From this vantage, internal democracy might hurt representative democracy, paradoxically, by producing choices that the majority of voters don't actually want. End quote. So by and large, the idea is that the most radical members will win that democratic election, which makes the party radical, which means it alienates more voters who may be middle of the road. But an undemocratic party will present a middle of the road unified front, keeping quiet the more radical voices within its organization. So those are two possible explanations. But yeah, back to you. I mean, do you feel like either of these make sense?
Let's take the second one about the radical elements getting elected or selected. This argument which is being made also for the primary system, right? For the presidential election in the US.
In the US, right.
In the first round of the primary, right? Within the Democrats and Republicans on each side, the more extreme views and more extreme positions are being voted upon, right? Because that's really where the base is in a way, right? And therefore you get a very extreme left-wing view or left-wing person getting sort of nominated.
Yeah, that's why you have Bernie, yeah.
Yeah, right. So you get Bernie Sanders on one end, then you get a Trump on the other, right? And therefore, but in this second round, right, in the second round of the election, they both have to somehow find a middle ground.
Yeah.
Come to the median voter, right? That's where the votes are for the larger public. And therefore, I think that argument makes an interesting. Now I'm just thinking through that does that have any salience to what we are discussing within the political party, right? So it's possible that I don't know how so that comes back to this question about what electoral mechanism are we using, right, within a political party. Just like what we discussed about the democracy as a whole, whether we are using first past the post or a ranked choice system, right? So I think that will become interesting conversation even within a political party. That what system do we want to use to aggregate the preferences of the members so that we have a outcome which looks more cohesive
and moderate, middle of the road
aggregation of the preferences, right? And therefore, I think it's the same challenge we have for the electoral system for the country as a whole. Or for a democratic system, a national system, as it is for political party. And that could be interesting conversation there. So I'm just thinking one way to think about that is, okay, it would depend on the electoral system that they are using, right? Second, I'm just thinking out loud that what's about the private market that makes the competition positive in a way, right? It's a win-win proposition or what we call double thank you moment, right? While that doesn't seem to be the case in the political market and the political party. So I'm just thinking through the differences between the two. What is that we are transacting, right? So in the public choice view, what is getting transacted in the political market, right, is the vote. So ultimately, my winning the election depends on how many votes I am getting. So there's a buying and selling of votes as there is buying and selling of goods and services in the private market, right? And the whole thing is structured around that, right? Which is why they discuss around the power of money and all of those.
Even politics, the political election process could be viewed as a buying and selling of goods and services, right? But instead of using cash, I'm using my vote. By and large, what you're saying is I'm good at delivering the goods or the services of defense, infrastructure, whatever, all the things that we expect of our state. And in return, I would like your vote. Versus in return, I would like your cash. And I would also like your comments on the first point, which is that a democratic political party is a non-unified front because they're internally debating. And the parallel would be the company. The private limited company is a unified front. There is a king effectively on top, right? A small group of shareholders, a CEO, a board of CXOs, and those folks run the entire company. Even companies are not democratic. So maybe just as a flaw with the way institutions are arranged. Better institutions are not democratic than democratic.
I think larger literature in terms of the working of various institutions in a society, right? So, for example, the president or prime minister is elected person, while a Supreme Court judge is not elected person, right? A Reserve Bank of India or Federal Reserve Bank's chairperson is not elected person,
right?
So, I think there's a huge literature on that. Then, in what kind of arrangement or purpose of an arrangement where you would want somebody getting elected democratically, meaning aggregating preferences, while you want meritocracy sort of somehow defined, right? In certain other institutions like the Supreme Court or the chairperson of the Fed or Reserve Bank of India, right? And I think that's the interesting conversation in terms of the political party, right? That which you're asking that, okay, somebody who has a more direct control, command and control powers, versus somebody who gets elected through democratic process, and who would then serve the purpose better, right? So is a political party similar to, I don't know, democracy? Is it similar to running a Supreme Court, similar to running RBI? So it may be a different way of thinking about the institutions and what kind of process of selecting, appointing, electing a person to at the head of the institution would.
No, yeah, I agree. In fact, the parallel here I'm thinking of is a king and a kingdom. Because, we're talking, okay, let's say we go back to that first principle of a political party is ultimately a way to seize and hold on to power, right? Democracies are worse at doing that than kings and kingdoms. So, an oligarchic world would be, or a kingdom would be so much better at holding on to power, because that is the end, right? If the end is having power and holding on to power, then historically kings have been great at doing this. Democracies are non-unified. We sit and we debate, and every 5 years we elect a new person who comes to the fold. It's so much more intricate and difficult. But what we've agreed on mutually is that the end is not power. That's what we've agreed on, that the end is actually freedom, individual liberty, better infrastructure, we've made a long list of things that are so much more important than absolute power, which is why we've agreed on sacrificing some of that. So we don't have a king at the helm, but instead have these other goals that we've accomplished. However, on the political party side, if the explicit goal is only power, then how could anything be better at accomplishing it than this sort of centralized command and control? We have to come up with a few additional goals that a political party must be able to meet. The equivalent of what we do in our democracy, for then us to be able to justify saying that, okay, then they should be democratic because it is better at accomplishing those goals. It's not only about power aggregation.
So I'm just going back to my economics background and see that has any relevance here. I think it's a very interesting question to discuss. And I think it's really good to carry this forward even beyond our conversation here. So we say, what's a market? The way we define market is that there are 3 P's of a market system. One is the property rights. So it's clear who owns what, and therefore we know what the volatile transaction looks like in that case. Second is the price system. The prices are free to fluctuate and reflect supply and demand of the very goods and services. And third is the profit and loss system, right? So the third one is, of course, important in terms of who wins the competition and who loses the competition. And it's very important that the profit and loss system actually exercises its power in a sense to decide who wins and who loses, right? That's ultimately discipline on the system. And one way to think about that, the areas where markets don't do well are the areas where one of the 3 things or more is not really getting fulfilled.
Right.
So air pollution, market can't handle that because there are no property rights being defined. There's no way to enforce any property rights in the air. Right?
Very interesting. I've never thought about it this way.
So it's a clear example that how market would never be able to solve that problem. It's just not part of what market would be. Right. Second, for example, many of the issues related to pricing, right? So why prices of healthcare in the US is such and such versus other countries, right? So all of the prices that you think about, they're not free to move around. There are many obstacles being created either by minimum wage laws, rent control laws, and many such things that applies to many, many sectors. And you find that that's really one reason why the systems don't really work that well, right? And third is the profit and loss. An example that I use normally is the banking system, right? So the too big to fail idea, which has been the dominant idea in the sort of how we do the financial management, says that, if a bank is going to go under because they made sort of foolish choices or foolish investments, they would not be allowed to go under because it affects the whole financial system. And therefore, as we did in 2008 financial crisis and even before and after,
we rescue them.
We bailed them out, right? So as a banker, I know that if I make risky investments, if they work out, all the profits are mine. If they happen to not work out,
socialized
then
loss.
Cost is all on the taxpayers, right? And therefore, you would never expect banking to do well, right? because it's outside the market discipline in a sense, right? So unless you have profit and loss discipline working on the firms would not behave the way we expect them to behave, right? So I think the 3 Ps give you one way of thinking about where markets don't work well. Now just trying to see, okay, is there a way of thinking about political parties along this line that tells you why they don't work well in the way we expect them to work well from free competition, right? Or maybe there's something completely different involved, which is what we're trying to grapple with in a sense. Okay, what is it different about political parties that the free competition of the kind that we normally imagine is not creating, or not at least furthering, more democratic political parties versus more command and control political parties, right? If there's a open competition between the two, why one is not winning that competition?
Sometimes when we set up games, the restrictions we place on the game are very important to determining the potential outcomes within that game itself. So if we think about, let's say, the Indian democracy, one of the rules that we have is that I cannot wield a sword or a gun and come and take your property away from you, right? Given that is the rule of the game, we now have markets where you and I have to transact. It has to be voluntary. We have the rule. So we've set up a rule. It's like a chessboard. The bishop can only move diagonally, and now we play within those rules. I may even be willing to concede that if the rule that we set up is that political parties must be internally democratic, once that rule is set up and all political parties are democratic, whatever that word means, then we'll start getting very interesting results, right? It's a constraint that we place on the system, because sans that constraint, just like in, let's say, society, we will resort to immediate violence, threat, right? That will just be the immediate result. Nobody's going to sit and build the next great drug for cancer because there's no time to do that. Whereas this consistently worried about our safety, your safety, private property, accumulation of wealth. Those are things we're focused on. And the minute we're able to relegate that to the state, give them a monopoly on violence, then we get a peaceful society, free from incursion from foreign states or each other. Then we're able to focus on quote unquote bigger things, more utility-centric outcomes. And perhaps a parallel can be drawn here, where on the political party side, they are in such an anarchic world, sans regulation, that the only way to operate is this power grabbing mechanism. And if we were to alleviate them from the need to play the power game, then perhaps there are much more utility-centric outcomes that can be accomplished. I'm trying a steelman of your side here, but maybe this is a way to go about it.
Yeah, I think makes sense. You know, we talk about the Wild West in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Where anything goes, then of course, the guy with the big gun wins in that case, right? So, in a sense, you are drawing the parallel here that currently in the political market is such that anything goes.
Yeah.
And therefore, the guys with the bigger gun who have more command and control are going to win that fight, right? So you need to find some way of bringing something similar to the 3 Ps, which are in the private market to also work in the political market, right? Which also, I think, other way of thinking about the invisible hand of politics, right?
Yeah.
Just like we have one for economics. And so what would that imply? And maybe those constraints are the institutions through which we can align the self-interest of political party with the larger social interest of better governance.
Right, yeah. Because like you mentioned, the regulatory oversight that seems to follow companies, individuals, etc., has not seemed to follow political parties. There's a scarce collection of like a couple dozen pages that govern how and why they should behave. And it's perhaps the lack of that, and so no restrictions on how much they can do, that you're going to try and find every crack and exploit it, or the other person will, as one does in markets. And so more regulation means better outcomes, is one way to sort of steelman this.
Just adding quickly on that. So we, as you said, voluntary exchange and therefore double thank you moment, right? I'm just thinking through the battle that political parties are fighting for power is a zero-sum battle.
Unlike traditional capitalism,
right? While in a market is a win-win proposition, right? We both can win. We both have a higher value than what we started with, right? So it's a positive-sum game, at least potentially positive-sum game. Sometimes we may fail. While here is a completely zero-sum game.
But coalitions are probably non-zero-sum. That is, if two political parties decide to align as a coalition. So in India today, given the political climate, there's so much value in, let's say, the Congress allying with other regional parties for state-level elections. they may not agree on the fundamental policy, but ultimately because they want power and the BJP is so hard to overthrow, they may just. And then it's non-zero sum for those players. That is, except for the BJP in this case, if they were to lose that election, the all parties within the alliance, it's non-zero sum.
But only one party can be, one party meaning could be one coalition.
Okay, one coalition, right? Yeah.
One group can be in power, right? Other group cannot be by definition. So that's why I'm saying it's a zero-sum game, meaning only one side can win. Either is a one party or a coalition of parties or whatever that may be, right? But that side wins, the other side has to lose. And I'm just thinking through, is that zero-sum nature of the political game that creates that problem? And if that is the case, then of course there is no hope.
But when I think about...
you are change that nature of the game.
When I think about your analogy on the private company side, right? So think about if I'm somebody who's manufacturing eyewear, okay? Now, I am in constant competition with the adjacent business who's also manufacturing eyewear. And the non-zero-sum nature of that market is in relation to somebody who's not manufacturing eyewear. So, for example, my suppliers who are giving me the glass, the plastic, the transporters, right? All the way to the base of the supply chain. The person who's handling my social media, who may be doing marketing on my behalf, my distributors. For all of them and me, it is non-zero sum. However, that ultimate purchase decision that you as a customer make to buy from my store or the adjacent store, that is still zero sum. So there is a zero sum proposition in the traditional capitalist free market, which is two identical players selling an identical product. Only one may win, given that a buyer will only buy one or two, some finite number of products. It is the non-zero sum nature extends to those around me, all of my partners, right? All of that. What is the parallel on the, first, do you agree with this? And second, what is the parallel on the political side? There is no extended network now. It's not like the political party is relying on a supplier, a vendor. Just like on the capitalist side, there are not secondary and tertiary political party players who seem to have non-zero sum effects here. So then you're right. It has to be zero sum by definition.
But I think the example they were using for the market, that when I buy from your eyewear company as a customer, so I think zero sum, positive sum applies to the transaction between two of us.
Right, from the customer and me. Yeah, sure. Right? Yeah.
So we are thinking that, okay, I also benefit by giving you the money and getting eyeglasses from you. Of course, exactly opposite for you.
But that translates to political side, no? Because the voter and the political party are in a non-zero sum transaction.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking that if that is the case, that our relationship is between the producer and the consumer, then how does that apply to the political side? Right, where the relation is between the political party and the voter. The voter is, in a sense, the consumer in that case, right?
But there it's not zero sum, right? Because if I make the right vote, I believe that the banning of beef is integral to where I live. It has to be banned. I cast my vote, and then 2 years later, beef is banned. Non-zero sum. Like you have got power. I have got a social outcome that I want. So then that may translate.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Conundrum
and propositions to think about in terms of what's about the competition, the nature of competition and the nature of the product for which we are competing. How is that different in political market versus the private market? Right?
I'm thinking about strongmen, I don't know why, but if you told me that, Deepak, there is this political party where what they do is they internally have, democratic discussion and debate, and then they decide. That feels so lackluster that I have to cast my vote to this organization whose position is vague and left up to the internal debate and discussion. Because even on a spectrum, you could say that eating meat on festivals and holidays is banned, all the way to it is banned to even rear cattle for the purpose of even if you're exporting it. And I want that hardline position. I want somebody who's saying that this is my hardline position. Then I will end up somewhere along there. Maybe politically they can't navigate that hardline outcome, but somewhere middle of the road is where they'll end up. So I vote for the strong man, because the strong man is saying explicitly that this is my position and this is that. And I'm just wondering about the general appeal of strongmen. It's not only in the recent populist rise. By and large, throughout history, we've had a very strong attraction towards people who have these strong positions, big personalities, and it's so easy to coalesce around them as the symbol of what you want to believe in politically, than a nebulous democratic group who are so unclear in their communication because they're being process oriented and debating their way to a conclusion.
Well, let's. I think the question that we ended the first previous round of discussion, right, what does it mean to be democratically governed for a political party?
Right.
So let's go a little deeper there.
Yes, please.
And maybe there is some link from that conversation to what we are discussing now in terms of the zero-sum positive-sum game. So what does it mean to be democratically governed? Right. So one point I was trying to make is that as a party member, what rights and responsibility do you have? Right. So what are the rights that accrue to you as a party member? Now, if for example, in the party manifesto, the promises I'm making as a political party, right, came about through this messy conversations, discussion, debate among the members, right, and they came to conclusion that this is what is going to be party manifesto, right. Now, if that is the way that manifesto came about versus the other command and control traditional political party where the top guy says, these are the 5 things I want to put, this is what I promised to my voters, put that in the manifesto, right? What's the difference between the two? How is that being viewed by the potential voters, right, who have to make choice between these two political parties? And then I'm going one step further, that if the party once this comes to power, right, who is responsible, if at all, to ensure that the manifesto has actually been followed, right? So if it was a command and control traditional political party, the boss decided these are 5 things which are on the manifesto, comes to power, and next day decides exactly the opposite to those 5 things he or she promised, right? Nothing really happens to that person or that political party. They are in power anyway.
Yes.
Right. Until, of course, the next election cycle comes up. And that's usually too far away for people to remember what happened 5 years ago. Right. If, on the other hand, if the democratically run political party came to conclusion about the manifesto through a internal democratic process, and if the members also had the power, I don't know how that would be organized, but also they had a power to then hold the party accountable for implementing what they promised in the manifesto, right? Because that came through all our conversations and debate and discussions. And therefore, we all equally believe that this is really what's good for us and, of course, good for society at large, right? And I want to make sure that my party that has come to power through this promise, I want to hold them to account that they implement the promise and not really change once they are in power. Then I think that will have a lot more credibility, right? So as a voter outside, I see these two political parties. One looks like very clear-cut, big boss deciding exactly what the party is going to do. But I also know that tomorrow I can decide exactly the opposite. And I have no control over that. I see the messy process of democracy here. But I know that, okay, whatever they come to conclusion with, even though how messy that may be, I have some confidence that once they get to power, these guys are going to hold their own, in a sense, representatives accountable to fulfill the promise. Then maybe I have more faith in voting for these guys.
Super interesting. I can see this manifesting. So on the manifesto point, I don't know, the last Karnataka election cycle, I had a friend who lives in Chandigarh, and I sent her a copy of the BJP manifesto and the Congress manifesto, all logos removed, okay, and then said, please guess which is which, right? So which do you think was written by whom? And they were virtually identical in almost every way, and no way to really distinguish one from the other. And that's a point about how, like, the publicly, stated manifesto is just like a rubbish document that no one really reads, says vague things that, approximately make you feel good, not really concrete presentations. But I feel like what you are advocating for is not that manifesto, but rather an internal manifesto, right? It's an internal agreement among party members as to concrete things that they will certainly have accomplished. And sans that concrete, promise, it's not possible to get elected. If you make a concrete promise, then you will be held accountable a few years later when that comes around. So that's possibly something that I can see coming to power. In a traditional democracy, we have citizens. Who would qualify as a citizen to a party? As in this universal franchise, I'm assuming one person, one vote. Is it so? For example, let's say you are an elected member, okay, and you are currently part of the party. Do you get a disproportionately higher vote than somebody who's not an elected member or somebody who's just a karyakarta? How do we split this? I know you don't have a clear answer, but intuitively, who really plays?
I think your background in sort of startup ecosystem, right? Isn't that what happens? So when I have a new idea, a new company I want to build, there are investors coming in. So in the first round, right?
Shareholders.
Right? So there are various ways of dividing up the future.
But what would be the mirror to capital? So here we exchange capital for equity. On the political party side, what would you exchange for a vote?
So two things possibly, right? One, of course, how much power I have through my vote to get my ideas into the manifesto, right? So I say preferential, right? So I'm elected representative, so my vote has 3 times as much power than the ordinary member of the party, right? So therefore, my vote will count 3 times more because I have different positions acquired within the party. Or president would have 10 times more vote, I don't know, right? So one can think of some way of giving them little more power in the final say of what party stands for, right? So that certainly is one very important sort of contribution that one would make as a party member as opposed to ordinary member versus the elected member or elected office bearer.
Right, yeah. This I can actually see as a true possible outcome. I like this idea of having an internal manifesto because that's the way ideally party members feel most slighted when stated party goals are not met. As a public, we may sort of like let them go, but internally they're quite irate because their entire life is being a part of this party. And I'm also thinking about what it means to be part of an opposition in this sort of a world, right? So if you're a political party who is playing the role of an opposition because you've not garnered enough votes to be in power, and I'm not thinking about this ground level gram sort of setup, but more the way the Indian democracy presents today, then could it not just be that the opposition says, my manifesto has promises only implementable based on the acquisition of power, right? And so I'm clearly going to miss my mark. Every time we come back to vote, I would not have been able to accomplish it because I simply don't have anything to do. I don't have a way to write these bills, pass it through parliament. None of this is possible. So what do you think happens with an opposition? Like when a political party plays the role of opposition, what is the democracy making this decision on now? Is it the reacquisition of power or is it playing the role of a meaningful opposition? Because we want that, right? Ideally, we want the opposition to play the role of a meaningful opposition, not just as like putting a stick in the wheel of democracy.
I'm just thinking through that maybe we can take a concrete example of a policy and see how that will play out.
The farm laws are a good example. So clearly something that the Congress had advocated for internally for many years. Then the BJP brought to the front. And the result was simply we will hold strikes and we will prevent the passing of the bills. And no real consistency about the fact that in the past I advocated for the same thing. And we've seen this on both sides, right? Like both political parties will happily forget about what they had said just a few mere years ago if it means that power acquisition is the goal. So maybe that's an example of where the opposition should have played a more nuanced role of saying these are things we actually agree with you on in terms of reform and these are things we disagree with you on. And a more nuanced opposition is one that we want in a democracy like ours as opposed to just a blanket no to everything that the ruling party does.
I think many of the people in the Congress did support, individually. And I think there are a lot of people who wrote also in public spaces about why those reforms are required. Right? Of course, party as a whole did not really stood by those ideas. So my sense is that in that case, there was no pressure from the members. Right? So the leadership is pretty much without consequence in some sense of taking exactly opposite position than what they have taken earlier. Right? If you had a sort of more democratic governance of the party, then maybe those leaders would have a no confidence vote and themselves be recalled from the position of power that they had. If the members generally were in favor of making those farm laws, passing those farm laws, while leadership was just taking opportunistic position to oppose them, just for the sake of opposing them, even though they know that most members of my party actually have voted for the same ideas a few years ago, right? So I think maybe that explains also the democratic governance could bring some of the more direct accountability of the leadership vis-a-vis the party members, right? And that could be one way to think about how this would have played out. I'm just thinking another example. For example, one party stands for, say, free market in alcohol, while other party has advocated a particular position of prohibition, like what happened in Bihar. Now, say the prohibition party has won the election. They come to power. Of course, they're going to pass a law to fulfill their campaign promise in a sense.
Yes.
So what's the role of the opposition in that case? Which in this case, of course, exactly opposite to what the other party has said, right? So you can think of ways in which the opposition can dilute or find ways of compromising the strict limit that the ruling party may want to put on the consumption or use of alcohol, right? And there are many ways you can sort of make it little looser than what it could be. And I think that's where the battle would then finally be played out, right? Can I find ways of diluting the absolute power that these guys, absolute restriction or prohibition they want to put in place, right? So can I make exceptions for, let's say, there's a Durga Mata temple and they are being, Mataji always served with alcohol as a prasad. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
and so it's a case for,
I
mean, my example is effectively a case for a more democratic political party, not less. And how do you think about representation? One part of Indian democracy has been, we want to have adequate representation across the board. That's been something that we've put into our constitution. And representation in the form of caste, but it could also be gender, it could also be, I don't know, age, any of the other distinctions that typically folks on the left draw. Do you think that they should carry through to a political party? Or again, the world I'm painting now is one where broadly we are setting up regulation that coerces political parties into more democratic structures such that better utility outcomes are a result of that democracy. That is, the anarchy reduces and they spend more time on good governance, good results as opposed to internal, power struggles. In that world, do we also want to, in that regulation, have boundaries around representation? And so, for example, recently we've had women representation in parliament be like a central point. But caste, of course, being one that the country's historically had. Do you have any thoughts on the representation side?
I think when you use the word regulation, obviously that's a red herring for a liberal person, right? That we are generally skeptical of regulation.
200%.
So, of course, at the same time, we also, as we discussed and established, that there is some boundaries required around the working of the political parties. And that's an interesting question to ask: is what kind of boundaries, and how strict the boundaries need to be for the political parties to function in the way we are discussing in a more democratic manner, right?
I mean, maybe just to not make, because I don't know if we can arrive at a meaningful answer to, should it be first past the post? Should it be rank order? We may not be able to arrive at an objective answer here. But I'm thinking more like, let's say the Election Commission had the broad responsibility of signing off once a year that the political party has met the adequate definition of democracy internally. They may internally figure out multiple ways to do this, but from a layman's standpoint, right, we should be able to broadly agree that this political party has met the definition internally of being democratic. Would that suffice as like a way for this conversation to...
I think that's an easy way to figure out how that can be implemented. So Election Commission has the same power over political parties that it does over the larger election that happens, right? Which I think, which makes sense that they would be the one responsible to enforce and monitor whether the elections were free and fair within the political party itself. So I think that's a very minimal regulation in a sense. And that may be just good enough to get us on the path that we want to go. And I think I'm just thinking through in terms of money, that power that we talked about earlier, right? If somehow it was possible that only money the political party can have is given by the members, right? And therefore, obviously, there are lots of accountability mechanisms will come in place because members would have to declare that I'm a member of a political party, right? And give the money, which parties would have to declare where the money came from. So it may also reduce to some extent. So I'm just thinking out loud that currently businesses give money to multiple political parties because they don't know in many cases who's going to come to power. And they want to, of course, make sure that they're not putting all eggs in one basket, right? And if your requirement was that you only can give money to the party of which you are a member, right? So then automatically that also aligns some of the ideological preferences, right?
But this feels very nightmarish to me. Like one thing I can think of is how prominent businessman from Gujarat will be a member of political party A, and his son will be a member of political party B. And so by and large, they are in both political parties. And because I'm the one providing the capital, I have the biggest say in the functioning of the political party, since they are shareholders in proportion, which means that suddenly we have like that crony capitalist directing state policy, which is like that crazy nightmare outcome that we try to avoid, right? Where we want a minimal state that cannot even enable cronyism. That's a more like a liberal's dream is that sort of a setup. So maybe that's something that may be a gap here. But back to the representation question. Maybe we leave this to a political party. Like in this world, I'm wondering if we're coercing democracy, do we want to coerce representation? That's the question.
No, I don't think so. And I think if the competition works the way we expect the way it works in the marketplace, right? Then obviously some of those issues will get sorted out through the competitive process themselves.
Right.
So if a political party feels that by putting more women members on the ballot is a good way to win elections, then of course they would put more women on the ballot, right? And my sense is that we were to see how that process will work out. It may not work out the way we imagine it to be work out, right? And then we have to figure out what are the hurdles in that process, and therefore may require even further thinking through what needs to change so that there is a more equal or proportionate or more fair representation within the political party.
Got it. My usual last question is I ask the guest to steelman the opposing side, right? So that is to let our democracy and its political parties function as they currently do without any interference in that process. But before I allow you to get to that, the business I'm in as an entrepreneur involves working with resident welfare associations, RWAs, right? And I've had it's been so exciting or interesting, let's say, to watch how an RWA functions, right? They've had to solve this problem internally, and every apartment complex has to individually solve this problem by themselves. How do we govern this limited space, this half an acre, 1 acre that we have, these 500, 600 apartments in the complex, and then solve for all public utilities? What does the RWA do? What do they not do? In almost all RWAs, they're not paid members. These are all voluntary members. So this is the citizen type who's entering because they care about the space. And who is allowed to vote, who's not allowed to vote. So for example, like a tough question is, are tenants allowed to vote, right? The tenant will say, of course I should vote, I live here. The owner will say, you don't even own the building, I own the building, I should vote because the property value depends on the quality of the space. And it's like a tough, so it's a very interesting bind. And the question I have is, if we were to look, and this is a similar problem, right? You have a political party that's not the entire country, it's not everybody a citizen. Some people are citizens. But unlike in a typical democracy where we all have similar value from a suffrage standpoint, equal, here it may be unequal, right? Like a company, you're saying shareholders, it may be unequal representation by person. So the question I've written down is that, and I'm going to try and read it out because I don't want to miss anything. We can think of parties as split into 3 phases, right? Party on ground, which is the members, the Karyakarta types. Party's central office. So this is managers, strategists, right? People who are broadly thinking through strategy of the party, including things like what do we say on social media? Do we attend this event or not, right? Strategists. And then the party in public office, which are the elected politicians, right? Is a democratic vote the best way to align interests between these 3 groups? Do they have different goals? And some of them may not bring in any money. Some of them may be getting paid, right? Because I'm part of the party, but because of my full-time job, I'm earning money from the party. And just as like a parting thought before you attempt a steelman to this, to the opposing side, if we were to build a democracy with non-equal players, what would that even look like? It could be shareholding, but is that an adequate, parallel here, or is there some other way we can think of structuring this?
I don't know how. It's interesting to think about what are the different ways one can structure this, right? So of course, one thing comes easy to our mind is the company structure, shareholders, and how that is being done. But that may not be the right way to think about the political parties and roles of members in that party. So I'm not sure how would that work. One can argue, as we discussed earlier, that those who are elected members of the party or office bearers of the party can have multiple votes in a sense compared to the ordinary city members of the party. But beyond that, I don't know whether there's any way of giving more power to particular individuals within the party. Would that be linked to like what you said about people how much money has been given by who? So would that be proportionate to the money that you give, right? Which probably would not make sense. And I suspect that if that ruling came to vote, most members would not vote for it, and therefore
exactly, would not be would fail its own test.
Part of the constitution of any political party, for that matter. So, as far as we know, as far as at least I thought about this thing, it seems that you would have to go by currently how we think about the RWA in a sense, more so along those lines than along the lines of a sort of publicly listed corporation, right? So I think between the two, it's going to be more on this side.
It seems more like that, yeah.
Right, because there's not very few people making money out of it, right? Most people are volunteers. And party members are not getting paid by the party for the work they do, right? So it's not like a company where everybody getting paid one way or the other. You're a shareholder, you are getting a profit sharing. You're an employee, you're getting a salary. Right? So it's interesting to think about what is it that we are doing today, which is similar to how the democratically governed political parties are likely to function.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And okay, so what's the steel man? And especially because you have more liberal roots, you are the non-interference type. So what is the case for don't touch this, let it be? Any amount of interference here may just be, may yield in consequences we don't want to, or roads we don't want to go down. If you were in my shoes and I were in yours, what would you say as the counter to all of this?
I think counter could be very simple, that this is how the political systems are structured. This is not a unique thing in any one particular country, right? This is how democracy seems to function as we know it. And therefore, maybe too many interventions in how systems are working, you're going to create maybe many more problems than we currently have, right? So one argument about unintended consequences that you talk about in the market intervention, applies also to, I guess, to some extent, to the political markets as much. So that certainly is a very, precautionary note, that before you redesign something that has evolved over a millennia in some sense, right? You really want to think through a little harder about what the consequences would be to change the structure of how political parties are governed, how the electoral systems are functioning, right? Whether you want to have power at the local level or central, the national level. So all of those are very important contentious issues.
Or like presidential versus parliamentary.
Yeah.
I didn't quiz you on that because it was not related, but I think all these are interesting questions. For me, privately, this has been wonderful to think about, because I feel like this democracy project that we're on is very new and early days, and we're still contending with the same questions most people who set out to build democracies have contended with historically, and we're unlikely to find good results. But it feels like the journey is not over, and clearly there will be edits to the structure itself over time. So I hadn't had a chance to think about it. Now I have. I'm very grateful that you brought it to my notice. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. And
thank you, Deepak, for inviting me. I think, as I told you earlier, this conversation also allowed me to think a little more and more deeply about the issues that I've been thinking about. I think just like any conversation over coffee or beer gets you a little further on the path. I think this really has been that experience for me. So thank you so much for...
No, thank you for coming on. I tell every guest this. It's a pleasure to capture you as a snapshot in time. 2 years ago, this may not have been forefront for you in terms of your intellectual thinking. 2 years from now, you may have resolved so many of these things that you're still deliberating through. And to be able to capture somebody in a moment in time, both for my own thinking and for yours, is a pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.